this side of town. 1931, a lot of things were happening that were kind of connected to all these things. This Great Smoky Mountains National Park opened in 1930. They built Chapman Highway to it. They built the Henley Street Bridge to connect to Chapman Highway, and they widened Henley Street into something like a boulevard. That was the original intent, to make Henley Street this gorgeous boulevard that led to the Henley Street Bridge, and which went onto the mountains. Again, the Henley Street Bridge was actually mostly a local project, was really a major work of architecture in itself. But this church, this land became open when they widened things, and this was had been mostly residential. There had been a school over here at one time, but they were able to come in here and build this extraordinary church here. The first Methodist church in town was built in 1816. It was a very small chapel, but over the years they were always kind of jockeying with the Presbyterian church. I think the Methodist churches were always a little bit more elaborate than the Presbyterian churches, and I think that's how Church Street got its name, after the Methodist church that stood there. The previous one that burned was another one of these just extraordinary big Victorian churches that looked like they're going to be there forever, and it turns out a fire was enough to ruin it. In fact, the congregation already started talking about the fact that they might need to expand or build a new church before the fire in 1828. This church was designed in cruciform. If you look at diagrams of it, like a classic European cathedral. The stone is not Knoxville stone; it's Crossville stone, and this was a instruction from the architect that this stone does not look dirty as quickly as Knoxville stone does. It just get the brown or tan color kind of, and in those days when soot was a major issue in Knoxville, that was something people worried about, how fast that building, a white building, would start looking dirty in a city like Knoxville. There's somewhere, David, I'll let him talk about, there's a marble slab from the old church which is on this property somewhere. Yeah, okay. Would like to know but the architect is mentioning the architect of this church in some factions might be enough to start an argument. This was a team effort between the local firm of Marvin McMurray, and as was often the case, you had a local firm doing the heavy lifting of the basic design work, and often a well-known, famous architect who kind of led the design. And we don't know to what extent the balance was, but the other architect working with Marvin McMurray is the single best known architect who ever worked in Knoxville. His name was John Russell Pope. You know his, if you don't know his name, you know his work. He designed some of the great monuments in Washington, including the Jefferson Memorial, is his best known work, which he did after he worked on the Knoxville church. He was known for the National Gallery of Art, the National Archives. These are all John Russell Pope jobs, and in fact some of them are also projects that use Knoxville marble in Washington. So that's an interesting connection to me. And we to this day don't note the extent to which John Russell Pope himself was involved in this. This would be his second Knoxville project. He had built a house designed a house on Kingston Pike, the Doolin House, which many of you remember as Doolin Art Gallery. That was a really unusual, extraordinarily beautiful house built in 1950 on Kingston Pike, which is still there now, a private residence. But Mr. Doolin had been associated with this church. He was a member of this church and was connected to the building committee. The guy that had hired Pope to design his house got Pope involved in the design of Church Street Methodist as well. Anyway, Marvin McMurray at this time was run by Charlie Barber and Ben McMurray. Charlie Barber was the lead architect of the firm at the time, and he loved the medieval. He loved references to ancient forms of architecture, centuries-old forms, revival styles. And you see his work all through Knoxville, especially in Kingston Pike and Squaw Hills residences. And to give you a sense of his other work downtown, he was extremely busy in the late 20s and early 30s, was doing some of the great work that he would be remembered for. If anyone's familiar with the YMCA, which you can almost see from here, he had just recently designed that building. And you can see some almost medieval or Renaissance touches in the YMCA. The general building on the office building on Market Street. I call it the General Building because that's the original name. It's a bank building with someone knows what building that is today, but on the corner of Market Street and Church Avenue. In fact, not far from where this church originally was. The one of his great works besides this church was the Hoskins Library. It's a really gorgeous building to walk inside, and it looks like it's been there for many centuries, and it was built about the same time this church was, in the early 1930s. But he worked with a lot of artisans on this church. One was a guy named T.L. Yon, Y-O-N. That does not sound like an Italian name, but T.L. Yon was an Italian immigrant. He was from the Piedmont area of Italy. Was a stonecutter like Albert Milani. I think it seems like almost all the Italians who lived in Knoxville in the 1920s and 30s were stonecutters. But T.L. Yon did a lot of the stone detail work that you see right around like the kind of floral or leaf kind of work over there. But he's also known for something else in Knoxville history. He and his wife opened a place called Yon's Spaghetti Shop, which was on West Cumberland near 17th Street. And that, as far as I know, was Knoxville's first Italian restaurant. But he was a guy that did some work on here. And so was Hugh Tyler. And anybody that studies painting in Knoxville knows the name of Hugh Tyler. He did a lot of interior architectural work. He was a good friend of Charlie Barber's. But he was also well known in literature in a way because he was James Agee's uncle, and he's mentioned several times. He appears as the character of Uncle Andrew in Agee's autobiographical novel Death in the Family. This is a very important and sympathetic character in a Death in the Family, Uncle Andrew. But Hugh Tyler was his real name, and he was a member of the Nicholson Art League, and actually was one of the last surviving members of the Nicholson Art League to still be doing work in Knoxville. And as far as I know, this church and Hoskins Library were the last things he ever did in Knoxville before he moved to the Northeast. The question about who was the basic designer of the church, this looks like for anybody that's familiar with Charlie Barber's work, this looks like a Charlie Barber fantasy. This church, it's like a dream that he had and realized. But we can't discount Pope altogether because Pope, even though he was known mostly for neoclassical monuments in Washington, very clean, crisp, white monuments, he also did design some Gothic revival churches. I think it'll be batted back around, back and forth for centuries to come. To get most of the design work on this. The construction of this church was connected with a tragedy. The contractor primarily in charge of this, one of the biggest building projects in Knoxville history at the time, was a guy named Harry Gervin. And if you remember, just a couple of years ago, there were some buildings on the Broadway Viaduct. They were right on the viaduct. One of the very few times when we built buildings on a bridge in Knoxville. Gervin's office was there. Anyway, Gervin Construction Company was in charge of this massive project. And in the early days of the church, when they were just delivering these giant chunks of marble on this corner, Gervin had an unpleasant surprise. A guy showed up and said, the guy just said, "Hey, Harry," and he turned around and just barely had time enough to recognize this guy before he shot him and killed Harry Gervin to death. It apparently was an ex-husband of one of Gervin's former lovers, and was, that murdered the guy right here on the side of the church as construction was getting underway. Anyway, it was an interesting story. There's a lot more to it. There's a